I first became aware of the Melungeons when I was studying or doing my work on Indian woods, and again learning about the Tuscarora and their ordeal, in North Carolina and Virginia. And I read Dr. Kennedy's work on the Melungeons, and it became very clear to me from reading his work that the people who considered themselves Melungeons in that region shared, cultural aspects that were very similar to the culture of Iroquois people. And, Tuscarora being Iroquois people, and then, of course, the rest of the Six Nations. So I became intrigued. I didn't know that there was a relationship or a connection, but, they seemed very similar. But in doing the research on the Tuscarora, what I found is that the Tuscarora people were triracial people even before the Tuscarora War. And their history went back to the Lost Colony and the fact that they say they absorbed the Africans and the whites that were left on the island in 1586 and 87. And so they were mixed people. And and the thing about the Tuscarora, which distinguished them from other native peoples in the region, the Algonquins and the Siouan Indians, was that they had large members who had European characteristics. I mean, hundreds that had European characteristics, which were green eyes, blue eyes, gray eyes, red and auburn hair, that other Indian nations around them did not possess and did not have. And the eyes in particular became known amongst other Indian nations as the Tuscarora Eye. And so when the Tuscarora War occurred, they were already thoroughly mixed. There were, literally, like I said, thousands of Tuscarora who had these European characteristics. And they were dispersed because we were talking about Blunt. If you talk about Tom Blunt and his people, the split in the Tuscarora Nation after the war, one of the things that bothered the Tuscarora after the war were people who had European characteristics. Because in the war, the colonists killed a third of their people, enslaved a third of their people, disrupted them, and basically drove them out of North Carolina, their ancestral home. And so they did not want to be reminded of Europeans. They didn't want to be reminded of whites. And Tuscarora who had green eyes or blue eyes or gray eyes, and Tuscarora who had red hair, reminded them too much of Europeans. And so many of those Tuscarora found it better to leave the nation, to leave the Tuscarora and settle elsewhere by themselves. And so large groups of them set out from North Carolina. Many stayed in North Carolina in places like Ahoskie and, in places like Indian Woods, Robeson County, and they scattered into the swamps and, stayed in those areas. But others set out and they followed trading routes that they'd used to trade in the 16 and 1700s with other Indian groups, and moved into places that they became aware of in the Shenandoah Valley and parts of Virginia. Also, it's important to understand that the main body of Tuscarora, when they left North Carolina after the Tuscarora War, moved up into Virginia. And you'll see maps in the colonial period in 1718, 1719, 1722, showing the Tuscarora in western Virginia and into eastern Kentucky and up into West Virginia. And what often people don't understand is that that region belonged to the Iroquois Confederacy anyway, and so it was territory that the Tuscarora would travel through and trade through all the time. The roads into that area, for example, if we look at the roads from east to west, and I think it's 58 that runs from the coast, from Virginia Beach all the way across southern Virginia. These roads, these highways, US 1, 15501, all of these were Indian trading paths, prior to the arrival of Europeans. And they became colonial roads. And today they are routes, US routes. But the Indians took those roads when they left. As the whites moved in, the Indians moved out. They wanted to get away from the whites. And so people found places that they knew and that they loved, and they stopped and they settled in those places. And it wasn't until the whites began to move into those places that they had to, renegotiate their situation. And oftentimes when whites came into Appalachia and into, the areas that the Melungeons, live in, whites didn't know what to make of those people, because they looked white, but at the same time they looked, other. And so oftentimes they were left alone, and, sometimes, they intermixed with some of the people coming into the area. But I mean, a lot of the people didn't know really what to make of those people.